Well, the Labour Party says knife crime in Scotland costs the NHS £500 million a year. But today, the director of the pressure group Straight Statistics, which aims to expose the misuse and distortion of statistics, says that's a fantastical number, actually 50 times more than he calculates using official figures. So I asked Nigel Hawkes how he worked out the cost of to the NHS of knife crime in Scotland.
Yes, we know how many emergency admissions there were for injuries with a sharp implement, of which most perhaps would be knife wounds, some would be bottles. We know that in the most recent year there were 1,245 emergency admissions.
And that costs how much then?
Well, we know also how many bed days were occupied. Because that was given as an answer in the Scottish Assembly. It's something over 3,000. We know what a bed day costs. And so we can work out the total cost of inpatient care. And by my reckoning, it's about £2 million a year.
Right. And leading on from that then, accident and emergency. You've had to make an assumption about people who were not admitted, but actually were treated in accident and emergency. What sort of figures are you looking at there?
Well, I couldn't find any precise figures for the numbers treated in A&E, but I worked out that perhaps there might be as many as 6,000 to 8,000. And we know that treatment in A&E costs about £100 per patient. So we might be looking at £750,000 for A&E. There might be other costs. Some people might go to their GPs and so on. But with the most generous assumptions I can make, I only get a figure of around £2.5 million a year.
And would that include assumptions about things like ambulance costs and other social costs, or what do you think would be the maximum cost we could rationally be looking at here?
Being as generous as I can, I've come up with a figure of around £10 million. I can't see how it can get anywhere close to 500 million.
Has any work actually been done in detail on this anywhere else that could give us comparative figures?
Yes, there was an interesting study done in England on similar injuries by a health economist at Brunel University. It was published in 2008, and it calculated the total hospital costs for England of these kind of injuries as £3.2 million a year. Now, England is a much larger country than Scotland. Scotland has a slightly higher level of violent assault. But even so, if the England figure is 3.2 million, it's impossible actually to believe that the Scotland figure is 500 million.
Yeah, what do you actually make of that figure as a statistician?
I think it's a fantastic figure. I'd love to know how they calculated it, because I've tried the best I can to come up with my own figure, and it isn't within shouting distance of the figure being quoted.
But given the information which you have used and on which you've based these assessments, presumably all that information is in the public domain. I mean, where did you get your figures from?
They all come from the Scottish statistics, NHS statistics in Scotland. There's an abundance of this sort of material around. It's not hard to find. So
these are official figures?
They're official figures. There are some assumptions I've made, but they've tended to err on the generous side. You know, I give a top figure of 10 million, but actually what I calculate is nearer 3. It could be 10, it could perhaps be 20, depending on your assumptions, but I find it extremely hard to believe it could be 500.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, I'm joined now from Aberdeen by Labour's Justice spokesman Richard Baker. Good evening, Mr Baker. Thanks very much indeed for coming in. How did you arrive at this £500 million figure?
There can be no dispute, Isobel, that knife crime costs hundreds of millions of pounds in Scotland. But in terms of this figure of £500 million, it wasn't produced by us. It was very widely reported in relation to a conference organised by the highly respected organisation Medics Against Violence around their work on knife crime. It's been widely reported and used for 3 years, and not only by us. So,
well, Mr Baker, can I explain to you, this afternoon we spoke to Medics Against Violence, and their spokesperson said they don't know where that figure came from, they do not recognise that figure, they do not do any research, and to them that figure is meaningless. Is this what you are relying on?
Well, what I can say to you is that in the various media reports around that conference, there was certainly, it was mentioned in a number of newspapers, the £500 million
yes, but
figure.
It may be mentioned in newspapers. This is such a serious issue, literally a life or death issue.
Isabel,
where is the research that you are relying on? And where are the authorities that you reference on this in reaching that figure? It cannot just be a few newspaper reports that you've read, surely.
No, I've also got a report from the Violence Reduction Unit right here in front of me now, which makes similar assessments in terms of the costs to the National Health Service in Scotland. And
£500 million.
Yes, it does make similar estimates around the costs to the National Health Service, but beyond that says that violence in Scotland in general could cost around some £3 billion. And I have to say, when you look at not just the health service cost, but in terms of the cost to our police service and our justice system, it's quite clear the cost
yes,
to
but Mr. Baker, that's
Scotland
not the argument
hundreds
you
of
made.
millions of pounds in terms of knife crime in Scotland.
That is not the argument you made. You said, Labour have said, that the cost to the NHS in Scotland is £500 million. A very authoritative study, for example, from the Trauma Audit Research Network at the University of Manchester said the whole cost of knife crime in England and Wales was £200 million.
Well, it didn't, Isobel. I've looked at that coverage in that report. It was talking about the health service in general, and some of those figures they've used are 10 years old now. I will actually take some issue with some of the assessments made by the gentleman who contributed in your piece earlier on. I think that some of these issues have to be far more debated. But I tell you this, there's no doubt that in Scotland, in terms of the Violence Reduction Unit and other highly respected authorities, that knife crime costs our society hundreds of millions of pounds every year before you take into account the human cost of people injured by knife attacks and those people who've lost their loved ones because of knife murders. So that's why we believe we are right in this policy. The SNP and others who oppose it can use whatever statistics or other arguments against it, but this argument is resonating with communities across Scotland because they know the toll of knife crime is far too high.
Well, Mr. Baker, this is an independent assessment here, which is based on...
Well, I've talked to you about an independent assessment from the Violence Reduction Unit.
It's an independent assessment from figures coming from the courts, coming from our hospitals, and coming from police officers. And
sorry, which report are you talking? I'm talking about the Violence Reduction Unit report, Isobel.
Well, I'm talking about the straight statistics report.
And they estimate it at hundreds of millions of pounds, and that's a Scottish study, not one based in Manchester.
If we look then, if you're relying now on what police officers are saying and what the general community is saying to you, what we know now is your mandatory jail sentence policy for anyone carrying a knife. We've got senior police officers saying it will not be a deterrent. We now have the Police Federation saying it's far too crude to tackle the fundamental problems. We have the Prison Officers Association saying the increased numbers that even you're relying on at 500 was in fact other independent assessments put it at 2,200. The increased prison numbers that would be involved there would seriously compromise the safety of prisoners and of prison officers. With all of that balancing against what you're claiming here, surely compiling this with the complete controversy now about, you know, this figure of 500 million against what is seen as a generous assessment of 10 million, this whole policy now completely lacks any credibility.
Isobel, you've chosen to entirely ignore the figures I gave you, produced by the Violence Reduction Unit, estimating the costs of knife crime at hundreds of millions of pounds.
Yes, but you haven't specified those figures.
But I think
you've come up with these figures are very specifically specified here. What I'm saying now is the body of evidence against the strategy is there's evidence against the strategy, whether it's a deterrent or not. There's now evidence against whether or not this actually costs what you say it costs in terms of the NHS. Your responsibility surely is to provide any policy that you have must be based on evidence, it must be based on fact, and it must be based on reason. And what the evidence tells us is that the SNP's policy is actually working in reducing knife crime.
That's absolutely wrong. If you look, for example, at the homicide statistics, just for the past year, they show, for example, in Strathclyde, a 56% increase in knife murders from 25 to 39. We still know we have thousands of serious assaults with knives every year. That doesn't sound to me like a policy which is working. There's no room for complacency on knife crime. That's why we are backing the calls for some 40,000 Scots for a clear message of carry a knife, go to jail, to provide a deterrent and to reduce knife crime in this country. Despite the fact that
all the experts tell you it won't be a deterrent, it won't work and you'll cause massive problems in the prisons.
I don't think that is what's being said across the board. I think even Callum Steele today acknowledged the fact that this could have a deterrent effect. Other police officers I speak to are very much persuaded that this is the right policy to have. And we believe that in terms of the human cost, the cost to our society of knife crime in this country, yes, we're the only party backing mandatory minimum jail sentences for knife crime because the evidence is there, the levels of crime are far too high, and that's why we will continue to promote this policy being backed by those people who unfortunately suffer the consequences of knife crime in their own lives.
Richard Baker, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.